So, welcome everybody. We're here at DNN Connect 2017, and today's session is about going pro with the two sexy REST and JavaScript APIs. So, if we're going to look at today's schedule, we have a situation where we have a lot of web modules and web applications today, which are, if you look at it from an outside point of view, it's usually showing data from a database. It's also usually going to have an edit dialog. And if you look at it from that point of view, that's actually 50% of most web applications. A slider, a tiny little form, whatever. It's actually just that. And if we keep on going and you add like a WYSIWYG editor and you add some asset management, well, that already covers like 80% of the use cases that you have. There's always more sophisticated cases like complete document management or stores, which are much more complex, but 80% of all the components out there are fairly trivial. And it keeps on going. If you add some data management features, including queries and multi-language, you're going to cover even more. And if you allow people to create custom user interfaces, you're kind of reaching the 99% use case where almost everything could be done the same generic way. And the point is actually we usually do this again and again from scratch. But actually, if you would use a platform under it which could provide all this for you, you could actually spend your time creating the user interface, planning it, making it look nice, and not invest too much resources into some back office work, which is identical to the last project you did and the previous project again, etc. So in today's session, we're going to be looking at how a JavaScript development is changing in 2017. It's crazy, seriously. Even I have trouble to grasp it. I'm serious. We're going to be looking at RESTful web APIs. Then we're going to look at using this REST in the more common frameworks we have nowadays. We're also then going to look at some JavaScript APIs to run CMS actions, to execute something like, please give me the edit dialog for this and this information, for those cases where you don't want a custom dialog, where you want to save time and just use the generic dialog. We're then going to go deeper into the toolbar and buttons API, and then some more background information on how internally the system works. So basically, it's for people who want to do cool front ends using JavaScript, whether it's just showing data or showing and editing data, and that want to save time on the back-end side. So let's look at 2017 in terms of JavaScript. Now, just so I know, how many of you are professionally developing JavaScript, like at least writing JavaScript code for business once a week? Hands up.
Does TypeScript count?
Sure, TypeScript counts as well. Yeah. Okay. So actually from the audience here, I would say it's about a quarter, and I'm actually convinced that's the current state of the DNN ecosystem. And it's really important that this changes because basically the web is going totally to JavaScript. The server side doesn't really matter anymore. So we're going to have @annotations. You'll see a bit of the code later on. We have modules where JavaScript code can be turned into a component and export that to make sure the namespace doesn't get messed up. We have constructors which were not possible in JavaScript before using TypeScript. We have completely different ways of writing things, and at first it looks like it's just a shorter code like the lambdas. It's a lot like we do in LinkU, but it's different. It does something different than just writing a shorter piece of code, and to understand that is very important. We have classes and interfaces. We have observables, which are going to completely change the way JavaScript applications are built. You're going to write a different architecture. It's more or less probably going to kill the MVC model. And trivial features like multi-line strings. So JavaScript is really the thing. And these are the things that I say you should be looking at if you're a web developer in this year. Node and NPM has kind of already gotten its place in the world, and Git, but I do still know a lot of people that are simply not touching it because it feels foreign. You're going to need that. You're going to need TypeScript. And what's also happening now is that JavaScript used to be really a tinkering toy box for people who really didn't know much about programming. And this has completely been turned upside down. Nowadays, JavaScript has all these architectural patterns, and you actually often need to use them to solve any kind of problem. It's actually become much of an engineering thing, much more than in the like doing Visual Basic in the old days. It's really much more thought through. And the reactive programming is a model which you're really going to need. So you could also learn Gulp and Webpack and things like that. Actually, I would put those on a lower priority because they're almost so fully automated today that you don't need to know them at first. And there's some things you really will unlearn. That's two-way data binding. We used to think that's a cool thing. It's turned out to be terrible. I used to think any language that doesn't have two-way data binding is stupid, seriously. And nowadays it looks like it's going to go forever. Promises, which those that did write some JavaScript have been learning to love, are going away. We're going to completely throw them out of the window. jQuery, it's Apache language to interact with the page. We're still going to need it a lot, but we're going to try to move away from it. Server-rendered HTML is dying, and the MVC model, we're not quite sure yet what's going to happen, but it looks like it's going out. So that's just an overview for the JavaScript world as it's coming out right now. And let's look a little bit at the REST work. So REST itself is a shortcut for representational state transfer, which doesn't mean much. But I just like starting immediately with examples. So let's say you would do an HTTP GET on this URL, and then you would get a list of all the persons on the system. Or you would do an HTTP GET with an ID, or you'd run a query, optionally with parameters. This is like a REST interface, meaning I have a URL, and I have a verb, a word which says I want to get something, I want to post something. And these words in front, you could even make up your own. You could say kick, and expect that this person gets kicked. Because these verbs are completely open, it's just a word. You can create new data, you can modify data just by sending HTTP commands and letting everything else take care of it. So if we look at the pieces of REST, we have a URL pattern, which is supposed to kind of say, what is it I'm talking with? We have a verb, which says what I'm going to be doing. REST is also completely HTTP based. So it's not trying to be something that you could also run on other protocols. It's really trying to say HTTP was a pretty good idea, and let's really use it. So we have headers, we use parameters, and we use the HTTP body to send the package that we're trying to do. Now, what you'll see a lot though is that the first samples you'll see with the URLs, they all look so simple, like /person/ whatever. In reality, you're going to run into a lot of problems because real life is never that simple. You'll have something like a batch update command, for example, or a term which doesn't really fit any of these trivial schemas. Well, in reality, that's fine because REST is actually very open to interpretation. It's really just the idea of having a resource represented by a URL, giving it a verb. But if you need to improvise and do it differently, that's totally fine in the REST standard. So let's briefly introduce myself. So I'm the Jungle Boy. I grew up in the jungle of Indonesia. My parents were missionaries there, and I had so much time at hand that I learned programming on the Bible translation computer. So that's my background. I then came to Switzerland when I was 17. I learned some German, founded the company, and it's worked out. And I'm the senior architect of DollarSexy, which is what we're going to look at next. DollarSexy has been supporting REST for 3 years now, and just last year we added the ability for external endpoints. This means up until last year you were able to use data from inside DNN, but you were not able to easily publish it publicly. And we enhanced the security model now that you could also say this is a public endpoint, and now you can also use it for that. That was added last year. So here's how it kind of works. It has the verbs get and post. We're We're actually limiting the verbs because there's, depending on the DNN installation, there's some filters in the way that would stop you from using certain words. Like put, for example, has had caused problems. So we're supporting get and post. There's a root path, which we'll look at in a moment, and basically you'll just say content/blog post or content/person, and then you will get that. You can pass it an ID, then you will get that. So it's very, very simple. You just do an HTTP request to that, and that's what you get. There's also the query system, which I'll show you in a moment, but it's the same pattern for doing URLs. And of course, when you post to these addresses, the query is not going to do anything. But if you post something to the all without an ID, it's going to make you a new one. If you post to a URL with an ID, it's going to update that data, that record. So here's a simple real-life example. This is an Angular application, which we see here. This is an association that does tractor pulling. So it's a pretty crazy sport where they have a big, kind of like a truck, which is really heavy, and it has a plow which digs itself into the dirt. So every meter it drives, it gets harder to pull. And they have these tractors, and it's like drag racing. It's like a lot of smoke, a lot of noise, a lot of beautiful women. And so you have to register to these events. You have to say, okay, I have this into this tractor. It has 800 horsepower. It's been tuned for this and this. You get assigned a category. And we created a little Angular app to register here. And so in the background, we're using this visual query here, which more or less says, okay, here's from the cache of the current app. I have like a filter because I should only see the vehicles that belong to me. I should only see the subscriptions which I have. I should only see all these streams here. And of course, if we run this, so this is like the basic setup, and down here you will see the URL that actually gets called up. It has a fairly nasty base path, but that's how DNN is built. Don't worry, it's automated for you. But so it calls the query my profile, and I actually pre-recorded it this morning just so that you could see it. Anybody that doesn't use Fiddler yet really should. So this is the result that I got, right? So I have a stream of drivers, a stream of events, a stream of subscriptions, of vehicle classes. So basically, this one single query, since it was prepared on the server to provide all these things based on my user identity, and some things, for example, the vehicle groups, these are not filtered because this is like a category information which some drop-downs need. So this query just delivers everything that you need. And because I'm logged in right now, it delivers some more information for the edit interface, which at runtime you wouldn't see that. So it's very simple. Basically, it's just an HTTP GET to this address, and we get all these kind of things. And so that, of course, is superior than trying to send one request to get all the car types, one request to do this, because you'd be sending like 20 requests, and there's a few challenges. One of the challenges is also making sure that your code doesn't continue until it gets all those streams back, right? Because you would only have partial information. And at least in the old world with promises, that was kind of nasty. With observables, it gets really neat. But this is just one request, you get everything, and it's taken care of. Now, the route path there changes a little bit from DNN to DNN. And it also changes based on the portal that you're in, because DNN auto-detects the portal based on the route path. So maybe you're not aware of that, but in the HTTP headers, there is nothing saying portal 17. It's going to use the route path to detect both the portal and the language the user is on currently. And so that's important to be in there. Then, of course, there's a part of the path that needs to know which app it's on. In our inline situations where the application is on a DNN page, we usually use app/auto because it'll auto-detect what module I'm on. Of course, from externally, this wouldn't work. There I would have to say app/blog, for example. But from internally, I want to do app/auto because there may be cases where a user added something to this instant. Like in a slider, I would add 5 pictures to this instance. I don't want all the pictures the app has. I just want the 5 of this instance. And so with app/auto, it'll know I'm on this instance of the app and deliver data automatically matching that app. that instance. To get the correct path, basically you can just get an SXC controller for your current module, which you can instance with a HTML tag or the module ID. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then it's just call a get, and all the other path information is going to be added automatically for you. So you don't have to worry about it at all. Just say, I need content person, I get it. I need query so-and-so, and I get it back. So it's very easy to do, and there are various tutorial apps out there on the app catalog that you can just try out and play with that. So app auto is important to auto detect what module we're on. It's also security aware. So in other words, I will create rules that say only people that are allowed to edit this module or only people that are allowed to view this module are allowed to create data. So for example, any kind of form which creates something, on this tractor pulling thing, there's a custom form for creating new records because we wanted to control the design of it. So of course, only people that are allowed to see this form, because they have to be registered first, are allowed to create data. Okay, and just a side note in case you run into some older code, the API path used to be a little bit different. It's still supported, but we just cleaned up and standardized the URL pattern. So content type is pretty obvious. We can get all items, we can get one item, we can update or create them, assuming the permissions allow it. Query, same thing. The query has a simple name, /query, /query name, and you get that. And you can also provide parameters, of course. I don't know, have you ever worked with the Visual Query Designer, for example? Anybody? No? So for example, here this is actually just a filter, and depending on which component you're on, you can just add different data source parts, and some of them are configurable. And in the configuration, you can say, well, I filter for number 7, or I filter for a tag like query string first name. So that's how everything is built. Even in the blog or something, we're actually picking up the value post this value here to match the correct record and then show the data for it. So here's an example of the blog that you just saw right now, because this is like, again, such a query, and this is sophisticated because we wanted to provide the ability for a next and before post. So in other words, in this query, we wanted to make sure we can have a read previous and read next. So if we look at the close-up here, you'll see that we're actually getting we're getting the current post based on the URL parameter, and then we have a separate query which will sort it one way and the other way, and based on this item, get the next one, and provide that through cache to the output. And I can use this query both on the server side as well as on the JavaScript side. On the server side, I can just hook it up or use the app query command. On the JavaScript side, I just run the HTTP post, and that's it. HTTP get. And then I have the ability to do this. So it's very simple, and for us, the Visual Query Designer allows you to use the same logic to query something on all levels of the framework. We actually developed this like 3-4 years ago because at that time Google didn't index JavaScript yet. It does now. But back then we were assuming we're going to have to build almost all JavaScript applications with the server-side backend as well to pre-render. And that's why we figured the queries thing has to be in a way that works across all layers. We got a little lucky that JavaScript now is indexed in Google, so we don't really need it that much anymore to run parallel, but it's still very easy to do. Permissions are, of course, an important point. Let me just see if I'm still logged on, that I can just show you this in live mode. Yes, so for example, a subscription will have permissions back here which say, okay, anybody that's allowed to view it has create permissions. It's a German user interface because this is a German-speaking website. So yeah, anybody with view permissions is allowed to create. And of course, anybody who is the owner, that means if he was the person who created the data, he is also allowed to read, update, and delete it again. And the permissions are extremely important. This is also why the first versions of TooSexy didn't actually have these REST APIs, because we really had to solve this problem first. You can't just open up your hole and say, okay, now it's going to run. And here's some typical scenarios you're going to use. If you're just running a JavaScript visualizer showing data, like creating a nice chart, creating a slider, whatever, you just want read for view users. If you have some kind of a form where you just have an input dialog for external users, you want to give them create, but you don't want to give them read. They shouldn't be able to query the data they just made. And of course, if you have data that somebody owns, like in this case in a private section, the viewers can create, and only the owners can read, update, delete. Admin and host users have those permissions anyways. And for public APIs, so in case I wanted to like change this to be fully public, I would have to say the condition is that it's anonymous, and then I would give them read access, or even write access if there's a good reason for it. So let's look at how this works in JavaScript frameworks. First of all, it's just REST with URLs, right? So if you're using external access, let's say you're coming from a different website, from a mobile application, or even from somewhere inside DNN, like a different portal, well, you're just going to need to have the full path hardwired, because there's no way you can guess that, right? The path is the identity. So for that, you would just do whatever framework you have, give it the path, and of course it shouldn't change, but that's always the case with endpoints. Remember to set permissions for anonymous. And you need to have this pretty long path here, and you would get your JSON stream and you could start working with that. If you're inside like AngularJS 1.x, there's a pre-built bootstrapping and everything system in here, which makes it extremely easy for you. Actually, you don't really have to do anything at all. You just need to make sure it's bootstrapped correctly. And then if you use the $HTTP, who's used Angular in here? Anybody? Angular 1.x? Almost, okay, 2. In Angular, this $HTTP is like the jQuery Ajax command, more or less. And what the bootstrapping does, it'll automatically prepare that for you so it has the correct headers and all that, and it'll automatically resolve the paths. So it's kind of like overriding the default functionality to make sure the security tokens are added so that DNN doesn't complain and all that. So if you bootstrap it correctly, it's just going to work like magic. The Angular extensions, by the way, also have a content service, a query service, which adds a little bit more level of comfort, and a toolbar service, which is made for creating in-page buttons, which we'll look at in a moment. And Angular 4, if you're interested in that, we'll look at that at the next session. So any other kind of JavaScript, because we don't have like a pre-built library for React or one for Knockout, it's still fairly easy to do. You need to get the controller for this module instance using $TooSexy. And then just use the command resolve service URL like you see here and continue with that. There you have to take care of the headers yourself. Have you guys ever done Ajax calls in DNN? Most of you? Yeah. Anybody here hasn't done it, because I would have to tell you important things right now. Anybody here not done Ajax in DNN? Okay. If you guys are fans of other frameworks, including Ember, Vue, or even Knockout, I would appreciate it if you would help to create such a basic library to get things hooked up. Yes?
Yeah, I have the same problems. We use Aurelia.
Okay.
For the front side, so
yeah.
It's more or less like I think Angular 2 a little bit close.
Yeah, yeah. Would you maybe care contributing something?
Yeah, we're trying to do a lot of things you already solved for Angular 1, I think.
Yeah.
It, so.
Yeah, that would be awesome, because if you could contribute it, we could include it in the default installation, so that when people need it, it's just there already. Like the TooSexy 4NG, which is actually installed whenever you install TooSexy.
No one uses Aurelia, so it's difficult to find people helping
yeah.
it together.
Yeah, but the more parts we have, the easier it is for the next guy to also solve the problem. Then there's some situations where the standard REST endpoints are simply not going to solve your problem. A typical case is that maybe you need to send an email, you need to do some extra special validation, you need to check something, change the state of something, and it gets complicated. Maybe we also know a lot of scenarios where you need to talk to a third web service, and you need security tokens, which you cannot put in the JavaScript for obvious reasons. So if you have that scenario, it's also very easy to do, but you're going to need C#. You can just create your own endpoint. There's a sexy API controller base class that you can inherit from. And again, there's some demo code. The most sophisticated is the Möbius forms, which is a forms, let's say, template system, which Luca and me created. He's that guy back there. So if you have questions for him, just ask him. And it's the path is slightly different, and you can work with that, and it's very simple. So that would be the REST part. I would now continue with some CMS actions and toolbars and buttons. If you have any questions to the REST topic, it would be a good point right now to ask that. Otherwise, I'll just continue on. Okay. Good. So basically, an action is when I tell the CMS I need to do something. I need a new blog post. I need a new picture. I need to edit this blog post. These are all just actions in the CMS. And it's important to understand that the action is not the button. The button will call an action, but the action is like, there's a library of commands that you can use. And this is built very similar to the TinyMCE model. Has anybody used TinyMCE in here? It's this WYSIWYG editor. And there too, if you want to like create your own things, you will have to always send it an action to do something. It'll do it, like make something bold or something, and the button simply triggers that action. So there's a separation here. And that allows you to use the actions in other cases as well, without the buttons. Or, of course, there's the entire toolbar API as well, which lets you create buttons, groups of buttons, which can rotate through the more button, and of course then all the settings like does it appear on hover or not, etc. So on top you can see like buttons inside an Angular application which are just more native feeling to the user, and down here are the hover buttons which we're all used to using in DollarSexy. So the actions, as I just said, can be called from any kind of JavaScript, including your libraries. And so you'll typically need these, for example, to say, okay, if I press new here, I want to create a new data set, a new record, but I want to pre-fill it maybe with some information. Like very often you'll have hidden fields maybe. A common case is maybe you want to keep the module ID in there for some reason, or you want to put the current page URL into something because you want to work with that, the current date, whatever. There's about 25 actions, and it's very simple to use. You need edit permissions that the JavaScripts are included, because if you don't have edit permissions, these scripts are not on the page. But usually you don't need CMS actions unless somebody's editing, which kind of makes sense. It's documented pretty well in the wiki as well. Then if we look at the toolbars, these are the most common way to call an action. So you can either just configure it by saying, okay, I need these 2-3 buttons for this item, like I have this blog post, and I need these 7 buttons. And that's the simplest way of doing it, and that's very easy to do. If you go hardcore, you can specify, you can change the icons, the colors, you can change what command is actually being called, you can put your own custom code into a button click. And also it's very similar to the way TinyMCE does it. So if you want to really specify something really, really special, it's also going to be quite a lot of JSON that you're going to create. So there's an easy API to do quick things, and there's a really low-level API where you can do everything. We decided not to make an intermediate API because it would make things much more confusing. You would never really know is this supported at this level or not. So if you want to really fine-tune it, you're going to be creating the JSON tree, which has a lot of detail in it. But there too, there's possibilities for shortcuts, so just look at it. And one of the important things I think is I've seen a lot of people use DollarSexy without the floating, without the hover buttons. So the way DollarSexy usually is used, or the way we would recommend it, is that if you are on any kind of page and you're going to provide edit functionality. Then we always recommend that you have hover buttons that take care of things for you. So because the way we work with it is we say the user should always see the page as the end user experiences it, and then he should mouse over things and modify them as he needs them. So you can insert components, you can edit them right here, but it should all feel like he's looking at the page in the end state. Now I've seen a lot of people that haven't done that. I don't know whether they didn't understand the concept, but I've seen some pages that are completely loaded with a lot of blue buttons, and that is not really nice for the end user to modify. So maybe the idea was it's faster or more discoverable, but we've really seen that this works very well for everybody. But if you want to, you can change the behavior. So there are cases, this is more like a demo, like this is one of our oldest JavaScript applications. It's the app catalog, and here, just for the sake of demo, we put the float on the left side. Now, what happens is if the float is on the left side, there's a strange phenomenon that if I press the more button, the length of the toolbar keeps changing, which is slightly annoying. And that's why you can also configure is the more button on the left side or on the right side, depending on what you want. So that's just the features that you have. It's all documented in the wiki. And this allows you to create an Angular or an Amber or whatever application which just works. And if the user is logged in as an editor, you can provide him extra toolbar buttons, and they behave the same way whether it's a HTML rendered on the server or from the JavaScript. The toolbar configuration, I'll show you one or two examples in a moment, but it's consistent in JavaScript and C# and Angular. For us, this was very important because documenting is one of the hardest things in software development. It takes so much time to explain what the thoughts are behind it, and if there were like different commands to do things on C# than in JavaScript, it would make it very hard to document everything. People would pick up the wrong snippets from the wrong places. So here's an example. I'm not sure, can you see it? Otherwise, I'll try to zoom in a little bit. This is a C# example, and you're seeing basically what we're doing is we're just creating a dynamic object here that's more or less a JSON object. It's just to write a JSON object in C# is slightly more tricky. So here we're just saying this is a dynamic object. This is going to, the button is always going to be visible. This is one of the cases where we said this button must be visible all the time. It will call up the admin list of items, so for managing things. It's going to tell it what content type it wants to see, and it's going to include a filter, because we're using this on the Möbius forms, and of course when the user has 7 different forms and he would like to manage all the records used on this form, he would only like to see them from this current module. So in this case, there's a pre-fill that puts the module ID in a field, and with this filter, he will only see those items. It also has the effect that when he exports it to Excel, for example, it'll only export those items that he had for that module, which is just what the people expect. If it would show all the records across the entire system and would export everything, it would be very confusing for the user. So this way, this is a custom button made especially for that, but as you see, we're using a standard action. We're adding some parameters so that everything works properly. And we have special floating behavior, custom floating behavior, just because we think that more matches what the user needs. Here's another sophisticated example. It looks sophisticated again because it uses the detailed API, because it's just going to do, one of them is a new button and the other one is the manage button. And this is what I'm saying. It feels a little cumbersome if you look at it the first time, but the point is once you figured it out, it's very easy to do everything, and you don't have 7 different APIs for doing stuff. And we're just seeing this pattern is what most JavaScript libraries are doing nowadays. There's a very detailed way to do it, and there are some shortcuts, but it's mostly do it the detailed way. One more thing to note, that here I'm doing it in Razor. So I'm using this edit toolbar command, which will automatically validate that the user is logged on and has edit permissions. If you do this in JavaScript, for example, you're going to need to have some kind of an information for yourself to know, is he logged on or not? Do I show the buttons or not? If it's only on a protected page, you don't have to worry about it. But if you want the same user interface for both users, the public and the editor, then you're going to have to do some checking there. Yep. Okay. So we're slowly nearing the end. I would like to give you a little bit more background information on how the $2Sexy works and the sexy instance situation. So what we normally have is we have a DNN page containing a lot of modules. And of course, let's pretend we had 2 sliders. Then of course the first slider has different pictures than the second picture. And if they do a web call, it should of course return the correct pictures without the developer needing to worry too much about it. So there's a small library called the $2Sexy, the $2Sexy, which is like the entry point for everything. And it's automatically included when users are logged on with edit permissions. And if you have your own JavaScript application for output things, like our app catalog here, for example, it has to be included specifically. So if I quickly look at the code of this, I hope I'm still logged on. Then of course in here somewhere we have a script tag which includes it. And don't worry if multiple apps would include it, and if maybe there would be some spelling mistakes, it checks if it's loaded twice, so it's not going to break. So you have to manually include it if you're going to do your own JavaScript front ends. And please don't copy it and put it in your deployment. Always reference the installation that is on the DNN, because if anything inside $2Sexy changes, the included $2Sexy is going to adapt to that, and if you use it, you're fine. So now comes a point where this is just the global controller that's on the page. But you of course kind of need like a controller that's specific for your module. Again, because of the module ID, content block information, and things like that. So the best way is actually to call it by instantiating it with the tag. Any tag that you're on, it's going to find out by itself, auto-detect what module it's on. Okay, so you don't have to include a token like put the module ID here in the template. We used to do that. There's still some sample code that does that, but it's not nice, and it doesn't cover all use cases. For example, we have scenarios where we have content inside content. I'm just going to show you this. So I think here is an example. Yeah. So this is a blog post, which of course you can imagine it's like a record of data regarding this blog. And you have the pictures, the files, the short URL, and here's a placeholder which says here is another component included in here. But that means if your code was running in that block, then knowing the module ID is not enough, right? Because the module ID is actually the blog itself, and you actually need to know where I'm on inside this block. And technically you could have blocks inside blocks, inside blocks. And so you have to know, or the system needs to know what it is. So just give it an HTML tag that you're on right now. In Angular, we usually give it the root tag. And bang, you have an instance-specific controller which knows which content block it's on, which module it's on, which security tokens it needs to use to communicate with the server and everything. So that's why the easiest thing is just use some HTML tag. And I really recommend that be the only way you do it. Of course, the older methods work as well, where you give it the module ID and a content block ID, but you're more likely to make mistakes, and it's also more work to do it that way. So you'd get a variable or a little object which takes care of you here, and that's what you would then use for resolving URLs or for doing API calls or whatever. Inside our bootstrapping for Angular and Angular 4, which we're going to look at in the next session, we're doing all of that invisibly. So you don't even need to know that at all. It just happens for you, and the HTTP service does this all. But you need to understand the theory behind it so you know why we're doing this. So let's do a recap of the current situation. We have REST APIs, and it covers all the basic operations, and it covers querying for like 95% of all cases. You have JS helpers, which can be used inside jQuery or any other kind of language. We have AngularJS, and there's the Angular. Angular without the JS is supposed to be the version 2 and up. You're not supposed to say the JS anymore. So there we have a prototype already that's working. We're going to demo it later on, and we have to finish the npm package so that other people can use that as well. Then it's important to understand that we have the $2sexy, which takes care of everything, and that you need a context-specific instance to keep on working. There's Actions, which will run commands on the server. I mean, not on the server, but in the UI, for pre-filling, etc. We have a toolbar, which is very configurable, and the API, the configuration there is consistent across platforms. So with these things, from what we've seen, this is actually all you need, that you can actually just focus on the front end, on designing, on the UIs. And it does take a little bit of learning to understand how it works, but you're going to save hundreds of hours not creating your own custom data import-export, for example, or your own WYSIWYG integration with picture management or something like that. Those things always sound so simple. It always sounds like you could start from scratch, but it always ends up taking 10 times longer than you thought. Took us 10 times longer than we thought. Okay, and what we would really appreciate is if other people would help contribute to create the matching libraries for the other JavaScript frameworks which are out there. We all don't know which ones are going to be popular in a year. Aurelia could make it, might not make it, I don't know. At the moment, Ember is really, really growing. And there's some people that think Vue is going to make it, but React is certainly in there. We don't have anything yet. We'd appreciate some help there. So if you have some time on your hand and you love these frameworks, we would appreciate your support. So that's the overview session here. Angular is going to have a little more code. That's going to be my next session. Any questions so far? So this is the end of this session.
One interesting thing you said at the beginning is that you think promises in 2017 will be disappearing.
Yep.
If I understood correctly. At this moment, I'm just looking at maybe transforming from HTTP GET to fetch protocols.
Yep.
Which is basically more or less giving back a promise.
Yep.
What do you think then is fetch not going to make it?
Okay, I'll repeat the question so that in case the recording works, it's going to be on there. Sure. So he asked the question whether if promises are on the way out, whether a request using fetch instead of the standard jQuery promise is like on its way out as well, or whether he's on the wrong track here. So the situation's actually a little different. Once you start looking at reactive programming, there's two important paradigms in there which change everything. One of them is the observable streams. I'm going to talk more about that in the Angular session afterwards, but the observable streams mean that you have various streams, whether it's click events, whether it's something that changes on the from the backend that's loaded, etc. And we're solving a lot of problems which took a lot of time to solve. But an observable stream is a little bit like a promise which keeps on delivering data again and again and again. It's like getting triggered again. Now, if you think it's a promise that just comes again and again, it misses a very key point, and that is that synchronizing these things to each other with promises is very, very difficult. And that's why any promise can be quickly turned into a observable, and the other way around as well. But what's going to happen is once you start architecting JavaScript to use this reactive model, your entire setup it feels much more like wiring up a switchboard and not like procedural programming where you say when this happens, do this, when this happens, do this. It's much more configuring how these things are linked together and then letting the engine run its thing. And as soon as you try to mix in promises there, you're kind of breaking the switchboard. And that's why if you go into observables, into reactive programming models, these streams, the promise is just simply not necessary or so in the background that you don't care about it anymore because you have a different programming model. Does that help you?
It gives a lot to think about.
Yeah, yeah. I have to say, we first tried doing Angular 4 we just thought we could quickly rewrite our code and, just change a little bit, different templating, but, not a big deal. And then we ran into all these kinds of tiny little problems which just didn't quite match up. And like we were running too many requests against the server, we realized we're doing the same request a few times because we had logic in there which said when this and this happens, do the request, but it happened more than once because other requests were coming back. And so we very quickly realized that with this model, we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot. And that's why we figured, okay, we have to really look at this reactive programming again. And it's also tied in with two-way data binding. People have loved that for a long time in the Microsoft environment. It's going out because it doesn't really, it causes more trouble than it actually solves. And that also has to do with observables because what we're kind of doing in the new world of JavaScript is you're not sending the message back up the view model. You're actually sending a message in on top again into an observable saying this is going to change. And then you have this observable tree doing things, and at the end the view kind of gets updated as a side product. And that's such a different programming model. If you start messing with promises, it's really not going to make you happy. But it's really been an exciting trip for us too. Okay, more questions.
Do that solve also programs where you need pushing data to the client?
Yeah. Yes. So it doesn't really matter whether the data comes from HTTP, like in a request, or whether you would be using WebSockets and pushing it. It's the reactive programming model is based on the idea that events happen. And that there needs to be a way of thinking about them which is reliable and not patching things all the time. Oh, I forgot that special case. Yeah, it's coming while this is still loading. Let me put another wait in here and whatever. So the reactive programming model is very different to think about. It's still JavaScript, but it's a different way to model your problem, including push. And I have some more slides later on in the next session.
One more question.
Sure, I have 5 more minutes left, so sure.
There are a lot of frameworks, of course. What do you think now that the DNN Core more or less chosen React? React Web?
Yeah.
Is that going to push also in the community, or what are your expectations?
Well,
how does this influence your product?
Yeah. So the question here is whether the DNN Corp has been using React for the admin interface, how this is going to influence the DNN community, and how this is going to influence DollarSexy. So what's certainly happening now, and this is a very good thing, is that people are now more interested in JavaScript than they were before. Because the DNN community, I mean, we were one of the first open source guys. We used to be the rebels in the Microsoft world. And now we're almost the oldies, right? We're now almost the Harley drivers, right? So it's like a rebel at heart, but calming down a little bit. And in the meantime, the young guys, the hipsters, were doing JavaScript, and this kind of scared us mostly. And so people were like, oh yes, jQuery sounds okay, and it feels like just patching up the few things I couldn't get to work before, and that's kind of been the attitude for a long time. Now that Microsoft has embraced Angular dramatically, and of course we have the other side, the React fraction. I would say, first of all, both of these frameworks can be used to solve the very same problems. But in some ways, and this is almost cynical, I would say Angular 2 is almost React with Redux and a few more things. So basically, of course, they too learned from the other side that there's like this Angular used to be proud of two-way data binding. Now they're saying don't do it. Angular now is completely stream observable based. You can still do a to promise, but it's not the way they're doing things. So they learned a lot from the way React does it, but React also learned a lot from the way Elm does it, or Ember. So these are other frameworks and functional programming things. So they're all cloning each other. So what's going to happen now is people are going to be much more interested in JavaScript. I think it doesn't really matter which of the two frameworks you use, or 3 or 4. It's important to use a modern framework because it makes you more productive. So I'm just hoping people will go into the JavaScript. I think what's going to happen is that React has an easier entry point. Angular feels like engineering crazy, and then when you finally reach the plateau, you can get really productive. And React makes you think that the entry level is very low. So if you would just look at both for an hour, you would say, this is too crazy, I'm going to go for React. But once you solve real world problems, you're going to be adding Redux and all these other parts as well. And suddenly the learning curve goes up to the very same point. And that's the point where you've learned functional programming, where you've learned observables, where you've learned Webpack. And when you've learned all those things, I think it won't matter anymore which tool you're using.
Thank you.
Okay. More questions? Well, in that case, thank you very much. Have a good day.